I was born in 1970 in London too. It's unusual pairing in that my dad who came from India,
Mm.
was a musician, and my mum, who came from Scotland, who was a seamstress, but also profoundly deaf. But I do remember my sister Sheila, who's next in line after me, being in hospital and having a brain operation. My mum stayed in the hospital with my sister, and my dad had to look after me. He couldn't cope, basically.
Mm.
So I went to stay with aunties and uncles. It became physically abusive of myself and my mum.
Mm.
Um, and but I felt like my childhood was just being in a constant state of terror. So I felt like, the world wasn't a place of love, it was a place of threat. The only kind of sanctuary I had was school.
Mm.
Once I started school,
Mm.
I loved learning, and I loved reading and stuff like that. And I think, looking back, if I hadn't had that outlet, I don't think I would be here. So kind of like a whole childhood full of pain.
Mm.
And then it all kind of came to a head at around 13, 14.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had a kind of few physical health issues. I had glandular fever, and then had a underactive thyroid, which in retrospect I found out can be a trigger for psychosis. I was being bullied at school, so my school as sanctuary was gone. My dad's abuse was escalating, the violence. And I think just one day, one Sunday morning, no, not morning, Sunday afternoon, listening to the top 30. So that's when I first started to hear voices.
Right.
Like I heard a sentence which makes no sense. It said, "How much do you need?" And I turned the radio off, and I still could hear this voice. But the next day, the voice came back, and really, that voice hasn't left me. It's kind of changed shape over the years. On that same day, I started to see kind of shadowy figures. It became worse. Like the shadowy figures became demonic faces, and the voices sounded demonic as well. And they were saying stuff like I was responsible for, I can't remember, was it an earthquake? It's like, this is 1984 or
Mm.
5, so I can't really remember. Basically, any problems in the world, I was to blame. Well, exactly 1 week after I started to hear voices, I tried to take my own life, because I didn't know what it was. To me, I didn't understand it was psychosis. I thought, demons were really there.
Mm.
I didn't have a family or anyone I could talk to. So to me, the only escape was trying to take my own life. Because I stopped going to school because I was terrified to leave my own room, social services got involved
Right.
and sent me to a child psychiatrist. And bearing in mind, I wanted to talk to somebody about my experiences because I
Mm.
was terrified. I went into this room, and this female psychiatrist was sitting in a chair with a clipboard in front of her face, and said, "What's wrong with you then?" And she kind of asked questions as if she was trying to accuse me of something. One time in the 20s, I was section, and the other time I went in voluntarily. I hit my 30th birthday, and I thought, I can't carry on like this, because psychiatry wasn't there to hear my story as I wanted to tell it. They were there just to kind of individualize the
Mm.
distress, rather than seeing what was
Mm.
what was causing it. On my 30th birthday, I said, I can't carry on like this. If I'm going to wait for psychiatry to save me, I'm going to wait a long time. So I thought, I'm just going to try and give it everything I got. I'm going to try and do what I want. And if somebody sat next to me and it was my turn to get off the bus, I was too shy to say, "Excuse me, can I get off the bus?"
Mm.
So that's how shy I was. So I realized I needed to develop confidence. There's that famous quote, feel the fear and do it anyway. That's exactly,
Mm.
that was my strategy. I'm going to do things even though I'm terrified. At one of these mental health coffee mornings, this guy called Jason Pegler came to promote his book company, where he said he wanted to publish people's mental health stories. And we talked because I during this time, around my late 20s and the beginning of my 30s, I started to write. And I only wrote because it was a way of expressing really painful things. And so writing about loneliness made me less lonely, that kind of thing. So I sent him some of my poetry, and he said, well, I'd like you to write your life story. Can you do it in 6 weeks? He says, I want to publish it for Mental Health Week in October. So I did it in 6 weeks. That's the start of my creative career. And the ball started rolling, and actually the ball hasn't stopped rolling ever since. So, for example, at that book launch of my first book, or my first autobiography, The World is Full of Laughter, after, we had the book launch in a pub, and that's where I met some of the people from Mad Pride. And they were just so lovely, so encouraging, and very cheeky, and they made me look at madness in a very different way. Actually, creativity and campaigning could be one way of making sense of my experience. I was on very heavy medications. I was on, like, I think at the worst point, like on high doses of antipsychotics and antidepressants and mood stabilizers. It kind of reduced my psychosis, but it also reduced me. It reduced my sense of self. It reduced my ability to think. It reduced my interest in the world. It reduces everything. One of my dreams was to go to university, and I realized I couldn't be on antipsychotics and do a degree. So I slowly came off of the antipsychotics, I think around about age 36, 37. I think I get excited to do creative work. I do excited to do campaigning work. It's a thing that enlivens, me. It's very soulful. It's not just an activity. It talks to my soul very deeply. I did a film degree at the London College of Communication in London, and I made loads of films about mental health, mostly. During one of the terms, I became homeless, and they were just really hugely supportive. And they would say, what do you need? And they would do their best to provide it. Most disabled people, if they're paying attention, are angry at government and politics. And I read about people who died because the DWP stopped their benefits, people like Mark Wood, who starved to death. And so I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to present the DWP with the names of the people they've killed. So yeah, they all had the idea to put people's names on hearts and just stand outside the DWP headquarters in London, just a silent, symbolic protest. So I spoke to Joy Dove, who lost her daughter Jodie Whiting to suicide because her benefits were stopped. The day we held up the hearts with names, I had one heart that didn't have any names on, and I would stand at the entrance and say to the people coming in and out, sign off the next death, sign off the next death. Why aren't you signing off the next death? The next thing we're going to do with the DWP has to kind of be a reaction to their indifference, and to their kind of continuing cruelty. And I thought, actually, let's section the DWP for being dangerous to itself and others. The panic and the anxiety and the terror I caused the DWP makes me very happy. They would just make assumptions about me. And this is a funny thing about the medical model is they would like to present themselves as objective, but if you look at any psychiatric record, it's just subjective assumption. I saw that Wellcome were offering funding. I said, I would like to look at your archives, and we found out there's only like under 10% is the survivor voice there. And 90% is the professional voice, and it's pathologizing, it's demeaning. And yeah, it was full of awful stuff, like finding out some women's clitorises were removed just because they were labeled as hysterical. But if you go back to see why they were labeled as hysterical, it was stuff like, oh, didn't cook their husband's dinner or didn't want to go to church. I just thought of this phrase the other day, the revolution will be pathologized and over medicated.
Mm-hmm.